Welcome back to the machine learning lecture. In this final video on dimensionality reduction and matrix factorization, we're going to discuss two nonlinear dimensionality reduction techniques. Let's start with some motivation. If we remember back to the principal component analysis method, which we discussed last week, this was a linear dimensionality reduction method. And in general, PCA tries to capture the global structure of the data. If you remember, PCA essentially captures the dimensions which have the most variance. And variance is a global property. However, trying to capture the global structure can sometimes be at odds with capturing the local structure. Let me give you an example which will illustrate this. Let's say we're given a dataset which looks something like this. First, we have this set of points which form this vertical cluster. In addition, we have this other set of points which form their own cluster, and this final set of points. If we run PCA on this data, PCA will uncover the dimension which has the most variance, which is this one. If we can also show this, and this will be the first principal component. Now, if we think about what happens when we now project the data points onto the first principal component, so when we take each of these data points and project it down to the principal component, we can visualize this in 1D. So again, this is the same principal component, the first one. And we'll see that, first of all of these data points will get nicely projected down here. But the data points from the green and the blue cluster will get projected into the same spot. And this is not ideal because these data points are far apart from each other in the original space, in the 2D space, but they've been projected close to each other in the low dimensional space, in this case the 1D space. Which means that now points which were far apart before, such as these ones from these ones, now become nearest neighbors. And this is not ideal because often when we're doing dimensionality reduction, we would like to preserve the clustering structure within the data. So how do we fix it? Well, simply we're going to devise an algorithm which directly captures the local structure by looking at the neighborhood of a data point. Before we dive into the details, I want to show you that this doesn't happen only in this one illustrated example, and it actually happens on real data as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the MNIST data, which I think you're already familiar with from some of the homeworks, which, for reminder, looks like a set of images, and on each of these images we have handwritten digits. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this image data, flatten each of these images into one long vector, and stack them as rows into a data matrix. So each of these goes here. And then we're simply going to do PCA on the data matrix, and we're going to compare the result with two other methods, the Tsne method and the Umap method. And this is how the results look like. Just to clarify what is happening here, we start with a high dimensional data. In this case, it's 784 dimensions, because as you flatten the image, you get 784 pixels. Then we do PCA on this data matrix, and we obtain three-dimensional coordinates. For each of the images, we get a 3D point. But instead of showing a point, because we're working with image data, we can simply show the actual high-dimensional image as an image at the point where it's embedded in 3D space. Then also what we're doing here is we're showing the label of the image, the ground truth label, with different colors. And all of this will help us gain a better sense of what is going on. But just to be clear, PCA doesn't actually know the labels, and the labels are only used for visualization. Okay, so now let's try to explore what is happening here. So we see that roughly it seems that all of the images which belong to the same class, which belong to the same digit, are clustered together. So here we have a lot of 1s, then we have a lot of 2s and 3s and so on. But if we look at the clusters, so in this case we have, as I said, 3D embedding, we can look at the 3D space. We also see that they are a lot intermixed. So we see here, for example, the 4s, the 7s, and the 9s are intermixed with each other, and the similar thing holds here for the 6s and the 2s and so on. So even though we see some clustering structure, if we didn't have the labels, so let me, for example, turn off the labels, this looks like a mess, right? We can't really tell apart, if we didn't know the labels in advance, that these are different clusters. Okay, now let's see what happens if we use a different method called Tsne. And this is actually one of the methods that we'll learn about in the rest of the video. Now we see that the data points are clustered much more nicely. So we see that the 1s are separated from the 7s, are separated from the 3s, and so on. And let's say we also turn off the labels. Let's say we didn't know them. Now we could still, even without access to the labels, we can still see that there's one cluster of data points here, and there's another cluster of data points over here, and then there's a third cluster of data points down here, and so on. What we also see is that Tsne has interestingly captured some other structure. For example, if we look at these 1s over here, we see that all of these are slanted slightly to the right. And as we go into the cluster, they become more and more straight. So interestingly, Tsne captured the variation in human handwriting, where some people write a 1 straight and some write it slanted. And this is the amount of slantness is increasing as we move down this cluster. Okay, and then just to show you yet another embedding method called Umap, which is slightly different from Tsne, but very similar, and it's also very popular these days. We see that this one does an even better job of separating the clusters. Right, so if we turn off the labels again, now it's very clear that this is one cluster of data points. This is another cluster of data points down here. This is a third cluster of data points, and so on. And the way these methods work, so both Umap and Tsne, is that they exactly try to capture the local structure, which means they look at the data point, and then they look at the neighbors of the data point, and they're trying to preserve the neighborhood, which is in high dimensional space, into the projection of the low dimensional space. And in the next slides, we are going to see exactly how to do that with Tsne. Most of the methods that we've considered so far are based on some form of matrix factorization, and this includes SVD and PCA. These methods try to preserve the global structure of the data, and sometimes they do so at the expense of not preserving the local structure. In the next set of slides, we're going to look at methods based on neighbor graphs, which are a different family of approaches for dimensionality reduction. And these exactly aim at preserving the local structure, or the neighborhood of each data point. The idea is simple. We're going to look at each data point, and we're going to compute the distances to all of the other data points. So let's say we look at this data point, and we compute the distances to this one, to this one, to this one, to this one, to all of the other ones. We'll repeat this process for all of the data points, and we're going to get a matrix of pairwise distances. So if we have n data points, we're going to get an n by n matrix, where each of the entries in this matrix tells us the distance from one data point to the other one. We can alternatively think of similarity. So if two data points are close to each other, if they have small distance, then they have high similarity. And if they are further away from each other, if they have large distance, then they have low similarity. And actually, more often similarity is used in the literature, but both of them are equivalent. Okay, so if we do this, let's say in this case, for the moment, let's imagine that this is some high dimensional data. We'll see that this data point is very similar to these other data points within its cluster, which means it has low distance to them, but it's dissimilar from these other sets of data points because it has a large distance to them. So now if we do this distance or similarity computation in high dimensional space, basically what we're aiming for is to find a low dimensional space where all of these distances or similarities are preserved, basically. So another way to think about this, and this is why these are called neighbor graphs, is if we think of each of our data points as a node in a graph. Let me number the data points for a moment. So now I'm just arbitrarily giving them some IDs. And for the moment, let's imagine that this is the node corresponding to the first data point. This is the node corresponding to the second one. The node corresponding to the third one. Fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh. We can imagine that these are nodes in a graph, and each node is connected with an edge to each of the other nodes, where the strength of this edge is proportional to the similarity. So if two data points have high similarity, then the edge connecting them will have a high weight, essentially. So these data points also are very close to each other in the original data space, so they have an edge which has a high weight. While if we now look at the edge between 3 and 4, this edge will have a very low weight because they're still connected to each other, but they are very far apart. And similar to, let's say, these two data points. So you can imagine that you're constructing this graph where each data point is a node, and the strength of the edge between two nodes is proportional to how similar they are. So what we want, in other words, if we have a high dimensional space and we build this similarity graph, and then we have a low dimensional space and we build this similarity graph, these two similarity graphs should look similar to each other. Let me illustrate that a bit better. So we start with high dimensional data. So in this case, this will be the high dimensional data. We compute the distances to all of the other points, and we put them into this n by n similarity matrix. Or other way to think about this, that this is the adjacency matrix of the graph I was talking about earlier. Or it's alternatively but equivalently a similarity pairwise similarity matrix. Or alternatively, it's a pairwise distance matrix. So all of these different interpretations are equivalent. Right, so let's say we've taken our high dimensional data, we've computed the distance from each data point to each other data point, and we've plotted it, or we've put it into this pairwise matrix, where now these filled in squares, so if the square is filled in, this means high similarity. And if the square is empty, it means low similarity. Or alternatively, high similarity means low distance, and low similarity means high distance. So if we've done this now for the high dimensional data, we see that these data points have high similarity to each other, but low similarity to everybody else. Similar, these data points have high similarity to each other, but low similarity to all of the other data points. Right, so just again, each of the cells in this matrix tells us how similar is this node to this node, or this data point to this data point. Now, this is some high dimensional data. could be any dimensional data essentially. What we're going to do is we're going to take low dimensional data and randomly initialize it to start with. And now for this random initialization, we can again compute the pairwise similarity matrix. The goal, what we're trying to do, is we're trying to get this similarity matrix to look like this one. So we want to move the positions of these data points in low dimensional space such that the similarity between them matches the original similarity in the high dimensional data space. And now we're going to look at a particular method for achieving this, which is very popular in practice. And this is the T-distributed stochastic neighborhood embedding method. This method, called Tsne, computes similarities in a particular way. The general plan is that starting with a pairwise distance matrix, we're going to convert this into a pairwise similarity matrix. And finally, we're going to convert the similarity matrix into a distribution over pairs ij, where the probability ij is high if I is very similar to j, and it's low if I is dissimilar from j. Okay, so let's see how we do this. Well, first we take a data point xi, we compute the distance to xj, and let's say this distance is measured as the Euclidean distance between the high dimensional vectors. And we take then this distance and we transform it into a similarity via the following function. And the way you can think about this function is that essentially we're putting a Gaussian distribution around the data point x. And we're converting distances to similarities via this Gaussian. So let me illustrate this in 1D. So let's say this is the 1D space, and this is where xi is, and this is where xj is. This is some other data point xk, and we also have some other data points. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a Gaussian distribution centered around xi. Now, the distance from xi to xj is this length over here, and then the similarity is just the probability of the Gaussian at that point. So you take the distance and then you just look at the value of the Gaussian at this point, right? And what we see is for the data points which are very close to xi, we get high similarity because this is a Gaussian distribution which is high in the middle and then falls down. And for all the data points which are further from xi, so like this one or this one, we'll get a very low similarity because the Gaussian has a very low value there. Okay, so this was one particular way of going from distances to similarities. You could also have chosen just to say similarity is the negative distance, or similarity is 1 over the distance, or something else. But the benefit of using a Gaussian distribution is that we can control the effective neighborhood. Let me illustrate what I mean by this. So now let's imagine that we have again the same situation. We have again the data points, and again this is our xi, and now we choose two different Gaussians. If we choose a Gaussian which is very concentrated around x, which means it has a very small variance, then only the closest data points will get high similarity, and everything else will quickly go to 0 and the similarity will be very small. If we instead use a Gaussian which is very wide, which has a large sigma, then not only these close points, but also the points that are further away will at least get some similarity. And essentially by controlling sigma, you're controlling the effective neighborhood. So let me write that this is low sigma I. Let me write that again. Low sigma I, and this is high sigma I. Going back maybe to the slide before, so let's say you look at this data point over here, and if you choose a low sigma I, then only these points will be its effective neighbors, because only to these points you get a high similarity. But if you choose a very high sigma, say a really large sigma, then all of these points will go into this neighborhood. Okay, and it is useful to be able to control the effective neighborhood because different clusters have different density. So if we look at another example, let me try and draw this. Let's say we have these data points over here, which are very tightly put together compared to these other data points, which are very further apart from each other. So if an xi lives within this cluster, we would like to have a small sigma I in order to capture all of its neighbors. But if, so that would look something like this. So if you put now a Gaussian which is very concentrated, you'll exactly get this tight cluster. But for a data point within this other cluster, our sigma I needs to be larger, the Gaussian needs to be more spread out in order to get this effective neighborhood. Because if we now only use a very small sigma, you'll instead get some small neighborhood over here, which is not what we want. Okay, and then notice that this parameter sigma I is set differently for each of the data points. So for each of the data points, we can exactly control how big its effective neighborhood. So which nodes count as similar and which nodes count as dissimilar. So this seems slightly not nice, right? If we have n data points, so this is some hyperparameter, we need to set n different hyperparameters, and choosing them can be very tricky. In general, also, the performance of this method might vary depending on how we can choose these sigma i's. And the way we do this is by setting a single parameter called the perplexity. But we'll get to this in a moment. Okay, so what we have for now is we had a matrix of pairwise distances computed in high dimensional space between each of the data points. We can plug in these distances into this function to get similarities. But what we actually wanted is to get a distribution over all possible pairs I and j. So the next thing we do is we do some normalization in order to get the distribution. Well, imagine that this is our data point xi, and now we have the similarity according to this Gaussian distribution to all of the other data points. And let's say these look like 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What we're going to do is we're going to take this vector of similarities and divide it by the sum, which means we get a vector that sums up to 1. And this is exactly what is computed over here. And the way you can think about this quantity is that starting with the data point I, how likely it is, what is the probability to choose data point j if we are sampling according to, in proportion to the similarity. So if I take this vector of similarities, I normalize that, and now I sample, how likely is it that I choose another data point j? Okay, and then we do this for all of the other data points. So we've done this normalization for xi, we've done this normalization for xj, and so on. So one thing to note here is that these two numbers, so the probability that I chooses j as its neighbor, might not be the same as the probability that j chooses I as its neighbor. And this is because we were setting these sigma I parameters, hyperparameters, individually per node. So from the point of view of data point I, j might be very close, but from the point of view of j, I might be further away. And then to take care of this issue, essentially, we construct this other probability Pij, where we simply take the take the two, the probability that I thinks J is its neighbor and the probability that J thinks I is its neighbor, and we divide it by 2. We also have to add this other division by n because we have n data points, right? So each of these rows of similarities, of normalized similarities, sums up to 1, and we have n many of them, so that's why we divide by n. So we divide by 2 because we're adding these two numbers, which is the average similarity basically, and we divide by n because we have n data points. And with this now, we have essentially obtained a matrix, n by n matrix, where the probability ij tells us how similar is node I, data point I to data point j. Previously, I mentioned perplexity as a way to set the sigma i's. The way you can think about this is that this controls the effective number of neighbors. In general, the perplexity of any distribution is 2 to the power of the entropy of that distribution. And the perplexity of a uniform distribution over k elements equals exactly k. Now, keeping this in mind, the way that we set the sigma i's is to achieve a constant number, a predetermined constant number of effective neighbors. Let's say we set the perplexity to 10. That means that we want for each of the data points to have roughly 10 neighbors which have high similarity, and the rest of the data points should have low similarity. So we optimize the sigma I independently for each of the data points via bisection in order to achieve a perplexity of k, a perplexity of 10, for example. And some good values of perplexity that work well in practice are between 5 and 50. So basically another way to think about it is that the number of neighbors, the number of other data points which have high similarity, is roughly between 5 and 50 for each of the data points. And because of this issue with different densities, each of the sigma i's might need to be different in order to achieve this roughly constant number of effective neighbors. Okay, so now we know how to set the sigma i's, and now we know how to compute the p of I given j's, and given those also the pij's, or essentially the distribution over all pairs I and j. What we do next is we start with some parameters. So these can be low dimensional parameters where we have one parameter for each data point. So this can be 2, 3, 4 dimensional and so on. And we similarly to this case compute a distribution over all pairs I and j. Here we do something slightly different. Here we take the distance between yi and yj. So these are variables to be optimized. So we take the distance, again, maybe this is the Euclidean distance between these low dimensional vectors, and instead of plugging them in through a Gaussian distribution, we plug them in through this other distribution. And this is the t distribution with 1 degree of freedom. The reason for using a Gaussian in the high dimensional space and a t distribution in the low dimensional space is that this fixes what is called the crowding problem. We'll discuss that a bit later, but for now it's not really important. So here we use Gaussian and here we use a different distribution. And because again we want to make sure that we have a distribution over all possible pairs, ij, in this case we directly normalize over all pairs. So this is all of the pairs KL. So we essentially, what we do is we take this matrix of distances in low dimensional space now, compute those distances, transform them into similarities via this function now, and then simply divide all of the similarities by the total sum in order to get the Qij probabilities. Okay, so now we have probability over pairs in high dimensional space. We have probability over pairs in low dimensional space. What we're going to do is we're going to make these two probabilities as similar as possible by optimizing the parameters yi. And the way we do this is by measuring the distance between the two probability distributions and minimizing this distance. And a way to measure the dissimilarity or the distance between two distributions is via the KL divergence. And the KL divergence looks something like this, where it's a sum now over all data points ij, so over all pairs ij. We have pij log over pij divided by qij. So this looks a little bit strange, but actually the KL divergence is used in many places in machine learning, and you'll, after you get some intuition on the next slide about how it works, you'll see why this is a useful way to measure distances between two distributions. The KL divergence is a natural way to compare distributions, and it is always a non-negative number, meaning it's always bigger or equal than 0 for any two distributions P and Q. And we have equality, that is, the KL divergence is 0 if and only if P equals to Q. In general, the lower this number, the smaller the KL divergence between the two distributions, the more similar they are to each other. Another thing to note about the KL divergence is that it is asymmetric. That is, the KL divergence from P to Q is different from the KL divergence from Q to P. And we see this directly from the definition of the KL divergence. We see we have this sum over all elements, pk log of pk over qk, and in the other direction this is reversed. Now we have sum over all k, qk log of qk divided by pk. So these two terms are in general not the same. So this version is called the forward KL, and this is called the reverse KL. What we want to think about now, if we're given two distributions, where the first one is fixed, let's say this is the ground truth distribution, and the second one is the one that we're optimizing over, how the KL divergence is going to behave, and how the solution that we find is going to change depending on whether you use the forward or the reverse KL divergence. So again, we have, let's say, some generic distributions, P and Q, where for the moment we can assume that they are discrete distribution over k elements. So we have P1, P2 over Pk. And Q is also a discrete distribution, Q1, Q2 until Qk. But now we assume that P is given, but Q is the output of some function which takes in parameters theta. And what we're doing is we're optimizing these parameters theta in order to get Q as close as possible to P. Or in other words, we're optimizing these parameters theta in order to minimize the KL divergence between these two distributions. And just to make things clear one more time, P and Q are distributions over n squared pairwise elements in the case of Tsne. And the parameters theta were these parameters of the low-dimensional coordinates of each data point. Okay, so that was in the case of Tsne, but this discussion actually holds in general. The question is, how does the solution look like if we minimize the forward versus the reverse KL divergence? In these illustrations, I'm actually showing continuous distributions, and the KL divergence is defined analogously in this case. So we just replace all the sums with an integral. And I'm showing here continuous distributions because it's slightly easier to see what happens. But okay, so now imagine that the P distribution, the one that is fixed, is this blue bimodal distribution. And the Q distribution can only take a shape as a one-modal distribution. Maybe our model, f of theta, is not powerful enough, or the parameters are not expressive enough. For whatever reason, the output of Q is one modal, and we're trying to now approximate as best as we can a two-modal distribution, P, with a one-modal distribution, Q. And what we're showing here is how the solution looks like if we minimize the forward KL versus the reverse KL. Let's start with the reverse. We see that the reverse KL is mode seeking. So the approximation shown in orange, has focused entirely on the mode of the data distribution and is not doing a good job of approximating the second mode. So this blue distribution is bimodal, but our approximation has only focused on one of the modes. And to see this, note that in this version, we have this leading term here, qk, where if this term is low or 0, it actually doesn't matter how well we're doing an approximation. Right, so if qk is 0, like it's in this case, the ratio of qk to pk can be anything, can be really large. It doesn't matter because we're multiplying by a 0, so we're not incurring any loss. This is not true in the forward Chao divergence, because in the forward we have a leading term where we're multiplying by pk. So wherever pk is non-zero, whenever we have density of the original, we must put at least some density of the approximated distribution q in order to not incur any loss. So what this means is that the optimal solution when we're optimizing the forward KL has to put mass everywhere. And this is the reason why we chose the forward KL divergence in Tsne, because we want to cover all of the modes of the P distribution. As a side note, KL divergence is used everywhere in machine learning. For example, in supervised learning, the PK distribution is the distribution of one-hot labels, and the QK is the distribution of the model output. Then this term, the KL divergence, turns out to be the same as the cross-entropy loss. It also shows up when we do regression and a bunch of other problems. But okay, back to Tsne. So basically what we did is we defined a distribution over all pairs of data points in high dimensional space. We defined a similar distribution between pairs of data points in low dimensional space. And in the low dimensional space, this distribution is parameterized by these parameters yi, which are the coordinates of the data points. And now, given these two distributions, we try to make them as similar as possible, and we measure the similarity or dissimilarity in terms of the Chao divergence. So we're minimizing the Chao divergence with respect to yi, and this is basically everything there is to the Tsne method. On the following link, you can explore how Tsne behaves on several different toy datasets. And in particular, you can change some of the hyperparameters in an interactive fashion and observe how the output of the algorithm changes. One of the most important hyperparameters of Tsne is the Perplexity Parameter, which, if you remember, controls the number of effective neighbors. And in this case, for example, we see that increasing the perplexity brings the two clusters closer together. But what is more interesting, I think, in the same link, there's a discussion of how you should be careful when you're reading Tsne plots. In particular, Tsne is used a lot in the sciences, for example, in biology, where people take gene data and then they down project it to 2D and 3D in order to visualize and better understand this data. But as you read in this blog post, you see that cluster sizes and the distances between clusters don't necessarily have any intrinsic meaning in Tsne. And why is this the case? Which means that whenever you're interpreting the resulting output from Tsne, you should always be careful and keep these gotchas in mind. Okay, but in general, Tsne is currently more or less the standard for visualizing high-dimensional data. People also use it in the machine learning literature, where they visualize the output of deep neural networks. So you can imagine that you have a deep neural network, and then you cut it at a certain layer where you have the hidden features or the learned features of the data. And then in order to kind of explore how these features behave, what you can do is you can use Tsne to down project them to 2D or 3D and maybe even observe how they change during training and so on. And why Tsne has become so popular compared to previous approaches is because it managed to reduce the so-called crowding problem, which I also mentioned earlier. And here I'm going to give you a brief intuition of what the crowding problem is and why Tsne might help here, but we're not going to go into details because this is out of the scope for this lecture. Imagine that we have 4 data points in 2D space, and let's denote them with A, B, C, and D. And they are arranged such that these distances are equal to 1. Now, imagine that we're projecting these data points to 1D, and we're trying to preserve the distances between them as much as possible. And this was really the core idea behind Tsne and similar methods, that we're trying to take distances in high-dimensional space or similarities and preserve these distances in low-dimensional space as well. And now let's say we have this particular embedding or projection of these data points, and these are also 1, 1, 1 apart. We see here that we do a pretty good job. So this distance is 1 and this is 1, so we exactly match it. Between B and C we have 1, also exactly match it, and between C and D 1, also exactly match it. But now if we look at the distance from A to D, in the original 2D space it was 1, but now in the 1D projection it suddenly becomes a distance of 3. And this is really bad. And in general, in higher dimensional space, there's much more room to embed points equidistantly from each other compared to the room that you have to embed points in a low dimensional space. So what is going to happen is, if you try to optimize these distances, the solution might look something like this, where all of the data points will just be bunched up closely together in the center of the low dimensional space. And this was the issue with the previous methods, which, for example, there's a method called SNE, or Stochastic Neighborhood Embedding Method, which exactly was running into this issue. And the main idea behind Tsne was, instead of using Gaussian distribution in the low dimensional space, was to use the T distribution. And if you visualize how this looks like, so maybe the Gaussian looks something like this, and this is what the previous generations of Tsne, or the previous versions that Tsne is building upon, were using. And the T distribution looks, let me use a different color, something like that. So basically the T distribution has fatter tails, which means that it allows for points to be further apart, and this helps to reduce the crowding problem. But as I said, I'm not going to go into details of why exactly this is the case, and this is not really important for you to know for the exam, let's say, but nonetheless, there is a crowding issue, and using a T distribution in the low dimensional space helps to reduce this crowding issue. Okay, so yeah, these are the advantages of Tsne. Some of the disadvantages of Tsne is that the output may be misleading, as I mentioned earlier. For example, even if you input random Gaussian noise and you use Tsne, if you choose the hyperparameters in a special way, it could look like the data is clustered, even though what you inputted was random noise. So always make sure that you kind of double check, use different hyperparameters to make sure that what you're seeing is actual structure and not some random noise. Another downside of Tsne is that it's random, so the output is not the same if you restart the algorithm. And also it doesn't behave very well if you try to optimize it for more than 3D dimensions. So that's why it's mostly used for visualization, and it's not really used for dimensionality reduction. Okay, there's a different method called the Umap method, which I showed you at earlier in the video, and we even saw that the Umap method for the MNIST data gave these really nice clusters. And the idea behind Umap is very similar to Tsne, but it bakes in some additional elements at exactly the right spots in order to improve the overall algorithm. And the mat for UMAP is way beyond this lecture. It is based on topological spaces and category theory and so on. But that's not really what you need to know. You need to know that you can take this implementation for UMAP and directly run it, and you'll get a good good low-dimensional projection of your data. Here's one example shown on the slides where we look at this 3D data of the animal, and then we see that not only are we capturing the different clusters, so this cluster of points is nicely projected here in 2D, and this cluster of points is nicely projected here, but also we see that the overall topological structure, so these sets of points are connected to these sets of points, is preserved from 3D to 2D. And this is one of the main advantages of UMAP. On the following link, you can, similarly to the previous link, look at some interactive widgets and play around with UMAP, and you can also compare how it behaves compared to Tsne and see which one is better. So in most of the cases, actually UMAP is better. In some rare cases, Tsne is better. But nonetheless, if you want to visualize high-dimensional data, you should use one of the two. Okay, that was it for the methods based on neighbor graphs. Actually, I want to make one more point here. So if we go back to the discussion of Tsne, so remember we had to compute this pairwise matrix of distances or similarities. And if you've been paying attention, you might think that this is very expensive, right? If we have 1 million data points, we have to compute 1 million squared possible distances. And this quickly becomes infeasible. But then what we've also talked about is by changing the sigma I, we're changing the effective neighborhood. So one thing we can do is, instead of computing all possible n-squared neighborhoods, we can do an approximate version of Tsne, where for each node we only find its k-nearest neighbors. And there's ways to compute the k-nearest neighbors with respect to this similarity metric in an approximate but fast way, instead of first computing all neighbors and then basically ignoring most of them, because most of them will have a low similarity anyways. And this is also what UMAP takes into account. So instead of computing all possible pairwise similarity, it looks at each node and it computes only the k-newest neighbors. And this, of course, helps the overall efficiency of the algorithm. Okay, but yes, so that's so far everything for the neighbor graph-based methods. We're going to see something similar in our advanced lecture on machine learning for graphs and sequences, where we discuss the spectral embedding, which is also based on neighbor graph methods. Next, we're going to talk about autoencoders, which are yet another way to do dimensionality reduction. The motivation for autoencoders is that the data often lies on a low-dimensional nonlinear manifold, like here in this example. And if we use linear methods like PCA, sure, we can capture the direction of most variance, but we'll never really be able to capture the intrinsic nonlinear structure of the data. Remember, PCA takes the original data and uses a linear transformation to obtain the projected data. And because we use a linear transformation, we can only capture linear variations in the data. The question is, can we use some different method to get a nonlinear dimensionality reduction technique? We've already seen actually one nonlinear dimensionality reduction technique, and that was the Tsne approach from before. But now we're going to take a slightly different approach using neural networks. The idea is simple. We're going to train a neural network called an autoencoder, which finds a compact representation of the data by learning to reconstruct its input. Let's illustrate how this works. So we're given a d-dimensional input vector, let's call it x, and then we're going to pass this input vector into a neural network called f, which has parameters w, and this neural network is going to output another vector of the same dimensionality. Let's call it x hat. And the way we're going to learn this neural network, the way we're going to learn the autoencoder and optimize the weights W, is by learning to reconstruct the input. That is, let's say the input is a 100,000 dimensional vector, the output is also a 100,000 dimensional vector, and we're simply going to minimize the difference between the input and the output. And the way this looks like is written down here, where we're minimizing the familiar sum of squared errors between the input and the reconstructed input. However, now the key part is that the reconstructed input doesn't depend linearly on the original input, but it depends in a nonlinear fashion. And this nonlinear dependence is implemented via the neural network. Okay, so maybe you've heard before that neural networks are very powerful, or that they are universal function approximators, or something along this extent. And now you're thinking that the best thing that this function can do is learn the identity, right? So if the neural network learns the identity, then you can take the input, apply the identity, get the same output, and then the difference between them will be 0, which means you have a 0 error. And this is true. However, autoencoders have another key part which prevents this from happening. And this is the so-called bottleneck layer. And essentially, the bottleneck layer is just a set of neurons somewhere halfway in the neural network, which have a much smaller dimensionality compared to the dimensionality of the input space. And it's called a bottleneck because you can imagine that information is flowing from the input through the output, and it has to pass through this small set of neurons which act like a bottleneck. And the idea is that this bottleneck will only filter out the signal in the data, will only let the signal in the data pass through, and it will filter out all of the unnecessary noise. So the bottleneck layer actually does two things. For one, it prevents the neural network from learning the identity, which would be useless, but also at the same time, it can serve as the low-dimensional representation of the input. So as you're passing the input in the neural network, the output at this bottleneck layer is exactly what you're going to use as the low-dimensional representation of the data. Okay, right. So in this neural network, as always, we have some weights, the weight vectors of each of the layers. Maybe this is W1, this is W2, we can call this W3, W4. And then the output at each hidden layer is potentially something like X, W1. Then we've applied a nonlinearity sigma, like the ReLU. Then we multiply this with W2. Maybe we apply another nonlinearity, and so on. And the same thing continues until we reach the output. Another way to think about this is that the first half of the neural network projects the data down to low-dimensional space, down to this bottleneck layer, and then the second half of the neural network projects it back up in high-dimensional space. And this first half is called the encoder, usually, and the second half is called the decoder. And they have a different interpretation, that the first part basically gives us a latent code, a small compact representation of the data, and then the second part of the network takes the latent code and reconstructs the original input. So you can think back maybe to some information theory concepts where you take the input, you code it, and then from this coded input you decode again the original. In this case, this is something similar what we're doing here, but we want only an approximate reconstruction of the output. We don't really need to get the exact same version of the input. Okay, we have a neural network. We know how to train neural networks, right? We just apply standard gradient descent, and the way this looks like on real data is something like what is shown on the slides. So here we're working with the MNIST data, which we have mentioned before, which is just a data set of handwritten images. And the way we're training the neural network is we're flattening these images into a long vector. we're passing these images through the encoder part of the neural network, which then gives us compressed representation, which is the output of the layers of the neurons at the bottleneck layer. And then given this compressed representation, this goes through the decoder and gives then the reconstructed input. And the way we've trained this neural network is by minimizing the differences from the output to the input. If you do this, if you train the neural network on MNIST and look how good it does, we see that the difference between the original images and the reconstructed images is pretty small. So here we're doing a pretty good job. Here, one additional thing to note is that if you only care about the low-dimensional representation, after you're done training, basically you can throw away the decoder, right? Because the decoder, the only function was to take the low-dimensional code and up project the data into the original input space, so you'll be able to train the neural network by looking at the difference. But if you only care about the low-dimensional projection, once you are done with training, you can simply throw away the decoder. The decoder is sometimes useful, and that is if you want to do a latent interpolation. So you can imagine that maybe you take the image belonging to 7, plug it into the encoder, and then you get its latent low-dimensional representation. Then you take another image, maybe it's the image of a number 3, you plug it also into the neural network, into the encoder part of the neural network, and you get its latent code. Now what you can do is you can interpolate, maybe linearly, between the first latent code and the second latent code, and pass all of these values as you're interpolating through the decoder. And what's going to happen, you're going to get a smooth, essentially a smooth interpolation from the 7 to 3. You're going to get a set of reconstructed images where the original image slowly morphs into the second original image. And this can be very useful, especially in some computer vision applications. What is also interesting here is that often people try to enforce additional constraints on the low-dimensional vector, where you want that each of the dimensions of the low-dimensional vector captures some semantically meaningful variation. Maybe if you interpolate the first dimension, so let's say the low-dimensional vector z is 5-dimensional, so it's 5D. Maybe if you interpolate the first dimension, and let's say the data is faces, maybe you're changing from faces with and without glasses. And maybe the second dimension changes the age of the person, and so on. So this is quite difficult. You need to do a bunch of extra modeling steps in order to enforce that the code captures semantically meaningful directions, but nonetheless you can still do it, and it relies more or less on the same principles as this normal autoencoder. Okay, here just a couple more things to mention is that when we have this bottleneck layer, when the size of the bottleneck layer is much smaller than the size of the original input data, this is called an undercomplete autoencoder. Sometimes we also have an overcomplete autoencoder where actually we're blowing up the data. The bottleneck layer is much larger, but this is usually less often in practice. What we also do when we're training autoencoders is we add penalty terms like L2 regularization terms on the weights, or maybe even an L1 penalty if we care about sparsity. And this works in much similar way to our discussion from the matrix factorization. Basically, they help prevent overfitting, and if we care about sparsity, it also helps induce sparsity in the learned representations. Another interesting thing which is unique to autoencoders is that we can do a so-called weight tying approach to also prevent overfitting. What we can do is we can basically take the upper part of the network and mirror it in the lower part using the same set of weights. So instead of having here W11, W2, W3, and W4, the weights down here are just going to be W1 transposed and the weights down here are going to be W2 transposed. So essentially, instead of having double the amount of weights, we cut the weights in half and we reuse the same weights to down project and up project the data. And this sometimes leads to better performance, but it's also faster to train because we have less number of parameters to work with. One very useful extension of autoencoders are so-called denoising autoencoders, where the idea is to train an autoencoder which learns how to remove the noise from the data. And the trick that we do is very simple. When we feed the data into the neural network, we pass in a noisy version, but then when we do the reconstruction, we use the clean version of the input data. So you can imagine that this is the clean, and this is the same input, but just a noisy version. And either we have access directly to a clean and a noisy pair of the same image or of the same data point, or if we only have clean data, then we can artificially add noise in order to create these clean and noisy pairs. But now, the only way the neural network can learn to do a good reconstruction of the clean input is by learning how to remove the noise. Variational Autoencoder is another more modern extension which is quite popular these days. We cover this in our advanced lecture, Machine Learning on Graphs and Sequences, or MLGS, which you can take next semester. Now, I want to also talk about what happens when the autoencoders implement a linear function. That is, instead of having some complicated neural network which is applied on the input, we're asking what happens when the encoder and the decoder are only linear functions. Or in other words, we take the input and we apply a linear transformation with some weight matrix W1. And this weight matrix essentially projects the data from high dimensional space to low dimensional space, from D dimensions to L dimensions. And something similar happens for the decoder, which takes the latent code, which is an L-dimensional vector, and up projects it to a D-dimensional vector with the weight matrix W2. So again, we just apply a linear transformation. And then if we look at the entire autoencoder, so when you apply the encoder and then decode the latent code, the entire thing is also a linear function. So you just take the input, apply W1, and then apply W2. Now, if we think about what happens with the reconstruction error, so we're minimizing over these weight matrices, W1 and W2. We look at the original input and the reconstructed input, but in this case, we know that reconstructed input is just a linear function of the original input. And if we look at these two problems, what we can do is we can collapse these two matrices into a single matrix. But we additionally have to enforce that this single matrix is of rank W. If you think about it, whether you apply a linear transformation with two matrices or a single linear transformation, which is defined as whatever the linear transformation is when you first apply the first one and then apply the second one, it's the same, right? So you can, let's say you know the W1 and W2 matrices, you can multiply them and get a different matrix called W, and this will be exactly the same transformation. And if these matrices are of size DL, and this other one is L times D, even though this is DL and this is LD, the resulting W matrix will be of size D by D. But because these have at most rank L, the resulting W will also have at most rank L. So basically now if we take this optimization problem and equivalently say we're gonna just work with one weight matrix W, but restrict the rank to be at most L, we arrive at this final optimization problem. And this optimization problem looks very similar to PCA or SVD. And the solution is just the top L eigenvectors of the covariance matrix of the data. Actually, interestingly, what happens if you train this with gradient descent, the way you would train a normal autoencoder, you're going to recover a solution which lies in the subspace spanned by the top L eigenvectors. The downside, if you train this with a gradient descent, is even though the solution is going to be in the subspace, it's not necessarily going to give you the exact eigenvectors. So it's going to give you essentially a linear combination of them. And the reconstruction error will be the same, but you won't have this nice interpretation that each of the eigenvectors aligns with the direction of most variance. But anyways, the point of this slide was that training linear autoencoders can be seen as PCA. And the optimal solution without considering the normalization is exactly the top L eigenvectors of the covariance matrix. Okay, so that was the last slide, almost the last slide for today, or for the lecture on dimensionality reduction and matrix factorization. And now I just want to make a short summary. We saw that dimensionality reduction and matrix factorization are quite related and are very useful in practice. For example, we can take data which is very high dimensional and project it to a smaller number of dimensions in a way that preserves most of the structure. For example, with PCA, we saw that we can find a projection which, for example, preserves 80% or 90% of the variance in the data. We saw that PCA and SVD, so the principal component analysis and the singular value decomposition, and now the linear autoencoders are all equivalent to each other, and they all find the optimal low rank approximation. So having a low dimensional representation of the data is useful because we need less storage for it, and we can also do faster processing. But beyond this, it's useful because it enables us to find hidden structure, hidden patterns within the data. If you think back to the movie concepts or to the movie factors, we saw that they capture some sort of semantically meaningful variation within the data. And if you do dimensionality reduction all the way to 2D or 3D, then you can use this for visualization in order to really try to better understand your data. We also saw that matrix factorization can be useful not only for dimensionality reduction, but also for rating prediction, which we could then use to build a recommender system. And this is a very general formulation. It allows us to basically handle missing entries, which none of the previous techniques could do. Finally, we saw how we can do nonlinear dimensionality reduction with techniques like Tsne and autoencoders, which can capture nonlinear relationships within the data. And both of these techniques have their advantages and disadvantages and might be appropriate in different scenarios. Actually, here I want to give one more example. So imagine that we're working with image data, and what happens now if we have the same image, but it's just translated 10 pixels to the left. In some sense, this is really the same image, right? Because it's just a translated version. But if we use a distance-based method like Tsne, we won't be able to capture this, right? Because if you take one image and you translate it, the L2 distance or the Euclidean distance into pixel space is going to be very large. But if we use autoencoders with convolutional neural networks, for example, so you can say that the encoder part of the autoencoder is a convolutional neural network which is invariant to translations, then this will not be an issue. Basically, two images which are translated will get the same latent code. So in this case, the autoencoders would be more beneficial. And in general, the nice thing about autoencoders is that you can adapt them to different kinds of data. So if the data is images, you can use CNNs. If the data is text, you can use RNNs. If the data is graph, you can use GNNs, which are graph neural networks, and so on. So this would be the benefit of autoencoders. The benefit of Tsne is that they really capture the local structure within the data, which is not guaranteed for autoencoders. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention, and we'll see each other next week where we talk about clustering.